Um, I, I also bring this up because I know that you're writing this book, or at least you mentioned that you were writing this book on the right wing, the dissident right, from centuries back to today, and how they used to be large and in charge, and now they're on their fringe. Their ideas that used to be mainstream now are considered extreme, and all that stuff. I think that part of it is my contention. You brought this up last time I talked to you, that women started getting really behind the Christianity, the conservative Christianity, and started pushing a lot of these things, becoming extreme with them. They started pushing people like to hate on the Prohibition era. They were behind the Prohibition, I heard. You mentioned that last time you were on. And so there was this opposite backlash to the women going too far with it. The men allowed these women to become they became Nazis, if you will. By Nazis, I mean overly strict with pushing the morality on people by force rather than just encouraging it and living it and letting people, to an extent, be drunks quietly. But now people are just shamelessly drunks and all that, partly in overreaction to the women going too far. And now the women are all a bunch of liberals. So I think that the women, because women become, there's this 1984 quote of women becoming, I think it's George Orwell, 1984, right? Where women became more bigoted in pushing the establishment values. They became team Big Brother or whatever it was, team Christian, team SJW, team anti-racist, team racist. Some of the women that I know are very critical of Jews right now, and so they go further with it and beat people over the head with it more than the men who are critical of Jews, for example. So I think that part of the decline of the right wing was allowing the spirit of going overboard with it, and the women going overboard with it specifically, led to our decline on the right. And now we're just hating each other and infighting. And that's why I mean evil versus evil, because evil is not just attacking the right wing. Evil people are not just hating the left, they're hating one another. I know there was a few different points, but it's the women,
Yeah,
the hatred.
I've never heard. Well, yeah, I'm interested in what you have to say. I don't generally hear. I mean, I hear people say things like, "Oh, women destroyed civilization when they got the right to vote. They made everything liberal." But you're not exactly saying that. You're
Right.
actually saying like women became hyper conservative and created this unbalance in society and upset everything and turned the tables. And then when the dust settled, everything was flipped upside down, and now we can't put it back together anymore. And I think like it's a it's not something you generally hear put that way, and it doesn't. Um, yeah, it's very interesting though, and yeah, I would love to explore that and think about that more. I agree with you that generally speaking, the progressive era that we're talking about, which was an era of so many different moral causes, right? So it was prohibition, but it was also fighting child labor and fighting for workers' rights and fighting for the 8-hour workday and fighting for abortion rights and fighting for, you know, and teaching evolution in schools and all of these different issues that were disruptive to traditional societies. Like, what do you mean child labor? Like, it's just labor. We all, I mean,
We
you're
all have to
6 years
work.
old, you can do chores. I mean, look, there's work to be done. So what is the issue here? What is the moral panic? I mean, people have always been drunks. Why attack this now? Why ban it? I mean, there is no point in Christian history in terms of Christian states like France, Germany, England. There's never a state that banned alcohol. That was not a medieval practice. Everyone was drinking alcohol. Kids were drinking alcohol. So why suddenly are you upsetting thousands of years of European and Christian history and saying all of a sudden, nope, we just determined alcohol should be illegal? It's like, where do you get the moral right to do that? Who made you God? Who made you a new prophet that you can? But the thing is, and it's really interesting, and I would love to really get into this because it's such a fascinating idea, is that during this period, the progressive era preceded by the Victorian era, there were a lot of prophets coming out like Joseph Smith and
Oh,
saying, yeah, I just received a revelation from God. We're going to do this completely new thing. Now, the question is, if we accept this to be true, that the burnt over district of New York, which is where Joseph Smith and a lot of these other Christian revivalists came from, if that is true, that there was a progressive or Victorian hypermoralization, that, we're going to start banning all these things. I mean, the Mormons are teetotalers, right? They don't drink alcohol. They don't even drink tea, right? They're very extreme. They don't drink coffee. So
yeah.
where is this coming from? Why are people hypermoralizing? Why are they jumping on these bandwagons and getting hysterical about things that used to not be a problem? And to me, the answer to that broadly is that people felt in the 19th century that Christianity was in crisis. And that's not something that's easy for us to understand today, because we're like, what do you mean? Like, they had churches, people went to church, people are Christian. Now, a minority of people go to church. We're in so much of a bigger, for the Christian church is in such a big crisis today versus where it was 200 years ago. What do
They,
you mean, the crisis of the 19th century? But the truth is that the Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire were not popularly received. There would be people like Frederick the Great and a court of nobility who would read a Spinoza or a Voltaire or an Edward Gibbon and these 18th century arguments against Christianity. But those didn't become popular or publicly acceptable until the 19th century with people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And that was the first time, and even Charles Darwin, right? Theory of evolution. It was
yeah.
the first time where elites, non-Christian elites, actually started to publicly proselytize. People like Bruno Bauer in Switzerland and Germany. And they were moving around a lot because local authorities would be like, hey, you can't say Jesus was fake, or you can't be an atheist. We're going to
Yeah.
kick you out of here. And so a lot of these people who were Freemasons or communists or Republicans or atheists, they would be bouncing around Europe because they would keep getting chased out of town. But the thing is, they were never killed. And the fact that they had access to the printing press means that, yeah, they would have to move from one town to the other, but they could continue writing, they could continue publishing, they could continue distributing those ideas. And because of the culture of literacy that had been ingrained through the Protestant Reformation, right? Everyone needs to read the Bible. Everyone needs a personal relationship with the Word of God. And so the common person by this time was actually literate and capable of reading, like, okay, what does Schopenhauer have to say? What does Bruno Bauer have to say? And so this was the first time in European Christian history where people were actually allowed to just be like, I don't believe in Jesus. And although it wasn't popular, right? Although atheists were nowhere as near a big group as they are today, the fact that they were tolerated sent a message. Everyone felt implicitly like, oh, we don't burn atheists at the stake anymore. Like, there's no more inquisition. We don't kill these people. We're religiously tolerant. And therefore, what does that mean for the future and the status of Christianity? Like, where are we as a civilization? Because for 1300 years, if you came out and said, oh, I don't believe in Jesus, you would just be killed. I mean, that was just the normal thing. And so the fact that in the 19th century, for the first time, you had public intellectuals, professors at universities, all of these very rich and famous people writing tracts and popular writings and saying like, hey, what if the Bible isn't true? Or what if Jesus didn't exist? Or what if God doesn't exist? And while the majority of people didn't say like, oh yeah, I'm going to abandon my beliefs and join you, the fact that it was even tolerated created a crisis of confidence that I think led to the behavior you're describing, which is that hypermoralization, like doubling down, like,
Yeah.
we're kind of uncertain. So when you're uncertain, just be like, now we're going to be super Christians, and now we're going to ban alcohol, and we're going to go to Utah, and we're going to found a new religion, and have Latter-day Prophets and things like that. So that's the narrative I would try to use to kind of dovetail with what you're saying, because I think it's very interesting.
That makes a lot of sense, honestly. I hadn't considered that even back then, it was kind of the last gasp of Christianity, of the Christian church, the Christians trying to hold on to their ideas of Christianity. I see that as kind of what was going on in the beautiful South, where they started lifting up these Confederate American hero monuments in the early 1900s, first few decades, because they were trying to hold on to the Southern heritage and heroes, because they saw this, the bubbling of the so-called civil rights movement rising up in the establishment against them. So they started doing these things. And it's kind of like us doing the Defense of Marriage Act right before they never honored it and did or even Prop 8 here in California. We voted for Prop 8, which was marriages between a man and a woman, and it was never enforced. The courts said no, and then they pushed so-called same-sex marriage on us. It's all these symbolic statements that we're trying to claim, and everybody's like based, or at least the Christians are like based, and actually no, we're quite debased, and you're fighting a losing worldly battle.
Yeah, no, I definitely look at things like Christianity from the perspective of those who propagate culture, those who maintain culture, and those who change culture. And the first category and the last category are ultimately more similar than they are to the middle. And so, for 1,300 years, give or take, depending on the region of Europe, there were bishops and kings and princes and knights and nobility and upper class people, literate people. Although, some of these kings didn't even read or write if you go back far enough. But these were the most educated people. These were the most powerful people. And what they did is they went around at first to the population. They didn't have them read the Bible. They didn't even really read the Bible to them just as a text. They actually developed these beautiful manuscripts. If you look back at medieval manuscripts, you find these beautifully, I mean, of course, the art isn't as sophisticated as the Renaissance or something, but for the time, that was the most advanced media technology they had. That was their social media. That was their AI. That was their Hollywood, right? It was these beautifully illustrated gold, enameled pictures that they would show, and they'd say, "This is King David. This is Jesus. This is Saul. This is Solomon." And they would teach people really through pictures and storytelling, and they would do it first among the elites. They would do it first among, tribal chieftains and people who had local power. And then that would be distributed and disseminated to the people. And this process, if you look, for instance, in Hungary or something, the Hungarian king converted to Christianity around the year 1000. Probably at that time, not all of the people in Hungary were Christians. But if you fast forward to 200 years later, pretty much all of the people in Hungary are Christians.
Wow.
There's really not a lot of pagans running around. And so I would say that when you have a change in the beliefs of the elite, the downstream trickle-down effect onto the average population has a delay time of about 8 generations or 200 years, give or take. It's not an exact scientific determination, but I see in the West, people like in the early 16th century, people like Rudolph II, who were really questioning this whole Protestant versus Catholic divide. They were like, well, I just want to have an empire. I just want to have a state. I want it to run well. I don't care about these doctrines and is the Pope good? Is the Pope evil? I just want a religion that works. And so they started to fund things that had already been going on, but they were very interested in things like alchemy and Kabbalah. And there's this idea of like, I would call this like a proto Freemasonry, because the central doctrine of Freemasonry is like all religions are kind of true. We're not really doctrinally wedded to any particular religion. There's this kind of universal religion, universal brotherhood of man that even transcends Christianity. So it's like a perennial concept. So this period, I would say the 16th century, is when you start to get these kind of proto-Freemasonic ideas surrounding alchemy and astronomy, right? Tycho Brahe. And it starts to conflict with church doctrine, Galileo, right? So there's this kind of early, Renaissance idea of moving away from dogmatic Christianity. Now, Rudolph II, I don't think he hated Jesus or anything like that. I think he believed Jesus was real. He probably thought he was a descendant of Jesus, because there were a lot of those things
Wow.
going on at the time.
Yikes.
So the European nobility in the 16th century was not anti-Christian, but they were coming out and saying, we are not doctrinally Christian. We're interested in Islam. We're interested in Kabbalah. We are not strictly wedded to Christian doctrine or dogma. And that evolved later on with the Enlightenment, got to the point where, yeah, you had people like Gibbon and Voltaire saying, like, we don't even agree with the Bible. We think the Bible is evil. It's too violent. We don't like it. And it's not until 200 years later that you actually start to get like common, regular people identifying as atheists or agnostics or non-Christians in any large number. So that process, that development, a shift once you have an elite that says, well, first, we don't really care about the doctrines of the dogmas, but we're still basically Christians. We still believe in Jesus. We just have some maybe heretical ideas about him, to the point of, okay, we don't believe in Jesus anymore in the 18th century with Voltaire and Gibbon. And then the 19th century, people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, who are like, well, we don't believe in Jesus, and we're going to publicly say it to the average common person. And then by the 20th century, you finally get like popular movements like Marxism,
Crazy.
where like you maybe have a working class guy and he's like, yeah, I'm a Marxist. And it's like, whoa, okay, that's really different from traditional European religion.